Unveiled, a master key to the mysteries of ancient and modern science and theology by H.P. Blavatsky, corresponding secretary of the Theosophical Society. Ceci est un livre de bonne foi. Montaigne, Volume 2, Theology. The author dedicates these volumes to the Theosophical Society, which was founded at New York, A.D. 1875, to study the subjects on which they treat. Chapter 2, Part 2. Christian Crimes and Heathen Virtues, page 89. The erudite author of supernatural religion assiduously endeavors to prove that by Simon Magus we must understand the Apostle Paul, whose epistles were secretly as well as openly calumniated by Peter and charged with containing disnoetic learning. The apostle of the Gentiles was brave, outspoken, sincere, and very learned. The apostle of circumcision, cowardly, cautious, insincere, and very ignorant. That Paul had been partially, at least, if not completely, initiated into the theurgic mysteries admits of little doubt. His language, the phraseology so peculiar to the Greek philosophers, certain expressions used but by the initiates, are so many sure earmarks to that supposition. Our suspicion has been strengthened by an able article in one of the New York periodicals entitled Paul and Plato, in which the author puts forward one remarkable and, for us, very precious observation. In his epistles to the Corinthians, he shows Paul abounding with expressions suggested by the initiations of Sabasius and Eleusis and the lectures of the Greek philosophers. He, Paul, designates himself an idiots, a person unskillful in the word, but not in the gnosis or philosophical learning. We speak wisdom among the perfect or initiated, he writes, not the wisdom of this world, nor of the archons of this world, but divine wisdom in a mystery, secret, which none of the archons of this world knew. What else can the apostle mean by these unequivocal words but that he himself, as belonging to the mystē, initiated, spoke of things shown and explained only in the mysteries? The divine wisdom in a mystery which none of the archons of this world knew has evidently some direct reference to the Basileus of the Eleusinian initiation who did know. The Basileus belonged to the staff of the great Hierophant, and was an archon of Athens, and as such was one of the chief mystae belonging to the interior mysteries, to which a very select and small number obtained an entrance. The magistrates supervising the Eleusinians were called archons. Another proof that Paul belonged to the circle of the initiates lies in the following fact. The apostle had his head shorn at Cenchrea, where Lucius Apulcius was initiated, because he had a vow. The Nazars, or set apart, as we see in the Jewish scriptures, had to cut their hair which they wore long, and which no razor touched at any other time, and sacrifice it on the altar of initiation. And the Nazars were a class of Chaldean theurgists. We will show further that Jesus belonged to this class. Paul declares that, according to the grace of God which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation. This expression, master builder, used only once in the whole Bible, and by Paul may be considered as a whole revelation. In the mysteries, the third part of the sacred rites was called epopteia, or revelation, reception into the secrets. In substance, it means that stage of divine clairvoyance when everything pertaining to this earth disappears, and earthly sight is paralyzed, and the soul is united free and pure with its spirit, or God. But the real significance of the word is overseeing from optome. I see myself. In Sanskrit, the word evapto has the same meaning as well as to obtain. The word epopteia is a compound one from epi, upon, and optome, to look, or an overseer, an inspector, also used for a master builder. The title of master mason in Freemasonry is derived from this, in the sense used in the mysteries. Therefore, when Paul entitles himself a master builder, he is using a word preeminently Kabbalistic, theurgic, and Masonic, and one which no other apostle uses. He thus declares himself an adept, having the right to initiate others. If we search in this direction with those sure guides, the Grecian mysteries and the Kabbalah before us, it will be easy to find the secret reason why Paul was so persecuted and hated by Peter, John, and James. The author of the Revelation was a Jewish Kabbalist pur sang, with all the hatred inherited by him from his forefathers toward the mysteries. His jealousy during the life of Jesus extended even to Peter, and it is but after the death of their common master that we see the two apostles, the former of whom wore the mitre and the petaloon of the Jewish rabbis, preach so zealously the rite of circumcision. In the eyes of Peter, Paul, who had humiliated him, and whom he felt so much his superior in Greek learning and philosophy, must have naturally appeared as a magician, a man polluted with the gnosis, with the wisdom of the Greek mysteries, hence, perhaps, Simon the magician. As to Peter, biblical criticism has shown before now that he had probably no more to do with the foundation of the Latin Church at Rome than to furnish the pretext so readily seized upon by the cunning Irenaeus to benefit this church with the new name of the apostle, Petra or Kipha, a name which allowed so readily by an easy play upon words to connect it with Petroma, the double set of stone tablets used by the Hierophant at the initiations during the final mystery. In this, perhaps, lies concealed the whole secret of the claims of the Vatican, as Professor Wilder happily suggests.
In the Oriental countries, the designation Keter, Peter, in Phoenician and Chaldaic, an interpreter appears to have been the title of this personage, the Hierophant. There is in these facts some reminder of the peculiar circumstances of the Mosaic law, and also of the claim of the Pope to be the successor of Peter, the hierophant or interpreter of the Christian religion.
As such, we must concede to him to some extent the right to be such an interpreter. The Latin Church has faithfully preserved in symbols, rites, ceremonies, architecture, and even in the very dress of her clergy, the tradition of the pagan worship, of the public or exoteric ceremonies, we should add. Otherwise, her dogmas would embody more sense and contain less blasphemy against the majesty of the supreme and invisible God. An inscription found on the coffin of Queen Mentuhept of the 11th dynasty, 2250 BC, now proved to have been transcribed from the 17th chapter of the Book of the Dead, dating not later than 4500 BC, is more than suggestive. This monumental text contains a group of hieroglyphics, which, when interpreted, read thus: Peter, Ref, Su. Baron Bunsen shows this sacred formulary mixed up with a whole series of glosses and various interpretations on a monument 40 centuries old. This is identical with saying that the record, the true interpretation, was at that time no longer intelligible. We beg our readers to understand, he adds,
that a sacred text, a hymn, containing the words of a departed spirit, existed in such a state about 4,000 years ago as to be all but unintelligible to royal scribes.
That it was unintelligible to the uninitiated among the latter is as well proved by the confused and contradictory glossaries as that it was a mystery word known to the hierophants of the sanctuaries, and moreover a word chosen by Jesus to designate the office assigned by him to one of his apostles. This word, PTR, was partially interpreted, owing to another word similarly written in another group of hieroglyphics, on a stele, the sign used for it being an opened eye. Bunsen mentions as another explanation of PTR, to show. It appears to me, he remarks,
that our PTR is literally the old Aramaic and Hebrew patar, which occurs in the history of Joseph as the specific word for interpreting, whence also pitrom is the term for interpretation of a text, a dream.
In a manuscript of the 1st century, a combination of the Demotic and Greek texts, and most probably one of the few which miraculously escaped the Christian vandalism of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when all such precious manuscripts were burned as magical, we find occurring in several places a phrase which perhaps may throw some light upon this question. One of the principal heroes of the manuscript, who is constantly referred to as the Judean illuminator or initiate, Teleotes, is made to communicate but with his patar, the latter being written in Chaldaic characters. Once the latter word is coupled with the name Shimeon, several times the illuminator, who rarely breaks his contemplative solitude, is shown inhabiting a crypta, cave, and teaching the multitudes of eager scholars standing outside, not orally, but through this patar. The latter receives the words of wisdom by applying his ear to a circular hole in a partition, which conceals the teacher from the listeners, and then conveys them with explanations and glossaries to the crowd. This, with a slight change, was the method used by Pythagoras, who, as we know, never allowed his neophytes to see him during the years of probation, but instructed them from behind a curtain in his cave. But whether the illuminator of the Greco-Demotic manuscript is identical with Jesus or not, the fact remains that we find him selecting a mystery appellation for one who is made to appear later by the Catholic Church as the janitor of the kingdom of heaven and the interpreter of Christ's will. The word pater, or Peter, locates both master and disciple in the circle of initiation and connects them with the secret doctrine. The great hierophant of the ancient mysteries never allowed the candidates to see or hear him personally. He was the deus ex machina, the presiding but invisible deity, uttering his will and instructions through a second party. And 2,000 years later, we discover that the Dalai Lamas of Tibet had been following for centuries the same traditional program during the most important religious mysteries of Lamaism. If Jesus knew the secret meaning of the title bestowed by him on Simon, then he must have been initiated, otherwise he could not have learned it. And if he was an initiate of either the Pythagorean Essenes, the Chaldean Magi, or the Egyptian priests, then the doctrine taught by him was but a portion of the secret doctrine taught by the pagan hierophants to the few select adepts admitted within the sacred Edita. But we will discuss this question further on. For the present, we will endeavour to briefly indicate the extraordinary similarity, or rather identity, we should say, of rites and ceremonial dress of the Christian clergy with that of the old Babylonians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and other pagans of the hoary antiquity. If we would find the model of the papal tiara, we must search the annals of the ancient Assyrian tablets. We invite the reader to give his attention to Dr. Inman's illustrated work, Ancient Pagan and Modern Christian Symbolism. On page 64, he will readily recognize the headgear of the successor of St. Peter in the coiffure worn by gods or angels in ancient Assyria, where it appears crowned by an emblem of the male Trinity, the Christian cross. We may mention in passing, adds Dr. Inman,
that, as the Romanists adopted the mitre and the tiara from the cursed brood of Ham, so they adopted the Episcopalian crook from the augurs of Etruria and the artistic form with which they clothe their angels from the painters and urn makers of Magna Graecia and central Italy.
Would we push our inquiries farther and seek to ascertain as much in relation to the nimbus and the tonsure of the Catholic priest and monk? We shall find undeniable proofs that they are solar emblems. Knight, in his Old England pictorially illustrated, gives a drawing by St. Augustine representing an ancient Christian bishop in a dress probably identical with that worn by the great saint himself. The pallium, or the ancient stole of the bishop, is the feminine sign when worn by a priest in worship. On St. Augustine's picture it is bedecked with Buddhistic crosses, and in its whole appearance it is a representation of the Egyptian Tau, assuming slightly the figure of the letter Y. Its lower end is the mark of the masculine triad, says Inman.
The right hand of the figure has the forefinger extended, like the Assyrian priests while doing homage to the grove. When a male dons the pallium in worship, he becomes the representative of the Trinity in the unity, the Abba, or mystic four.
Immaculate is Our Lady Isis, is the legend around an engraving of Serapis and Isis, described by King in the Gnostics and their remains, Ekyria Eikik Agna, or, more accurately transcribed, Ek Kyria Agni, meaning, O pure lady.
The very terms applied afterwards to that personage, the Virgin Mary, who succeeded to her form, titles, symbols, rites and ceremonies. Thus, her devotees carried into the new priesthood the former badges of their profession, the obligation to celibacy, the tonsure, and the surplice, omitting, unfortunately, the frequent ablutions prescribed by the ancient creed. The Black Virgins, so highly reverenced in certain French cathedrals, proved, when at last critically examined, basalt figures of Isis.
Before the shrine of Jupiter Ammon were suspended tinkling bells, from the sound of whose chiming the priests gathered the auguries. A golden bell and a pomegranate, round about the hem of the robe, was the result with the Mosaic Jews. But in the Buddhistic system, during the religious services, the gods of the Devaloka are always invoked and invited to descend upon the altars by the ringing of bells suspended in the pagodas. The bell of the sacred table of Siva at Kuhama is described in Kilasa, and every Buddhist vihara and lamasery has its bells. We thus see that the bells used by Christians come to them directly from the Buddhist Tibetans and Chinese. The beads and rosaries have the same origin and have been used by Buddhist monks for over 2,300 years. The linghams in the Hindu temples are ornamented upon certain days with large berries, from a tree sacred to Mahadeva, which are strung into rosaries. The title of nun is an Egyptian word and had with them the actual meaning. The Christians did not even take the trouble of translating the word nonna. The aureole of the saints was used by the antediluvian artists of Babylonia whenever they desired to honor or deify a mortal's head. In a celebrated picture in Moore's Hindu pantheon entitled Krishna Nursed by Devaki from a highly finished picture, the Hindu virgin is represented as seated on a lounge and nursing Krishna. The hair brushed back, the long veil, and the golden aureole around the Virgin's head, as well as around that of the Hindu savior, are striking. No Catholic, well-versed as he might be in the mysterious symbolism of iconology, would hesitate for a moment to worship at that shrine the Virgin Mary, the mother of his God. In Indur Subha, the south entrance of the caves of Ellora, may be seen to this day the figure of Indra's wife, Indrani, sitting with her infant son God, pointing the finger to heaven with the same gesture as the Italian Madonna and Child. In pagan and Christian symbolism, the author gives a figure from a medieval woodcut, the like of which we have seen by dozens in old psalters, in which the Virgin Mary with her infant is represented as the Queen of Heaven on the crescent moon, emblem of virginity.
Being before the sun, she almost eclipses its light. Than this, nothing could more completely identify the Christian mother and child with Isis and Horus, Ishtar, Venus, Juno, and a host of other pagan goddesses who have been called Queen of Heaven, Queen of the Universe, Mother of God, Spouse of God, the Celestial Virgin, the Heavenly Peacemaker, etc.
Such pictures are not purely astronomical. They represent the male god and the female goddess as the sun and moon in conjunction, the union of the triad with the unit. The horns of the cow on the head of Isis have the same significance, and so above, below, outside, and inside the Christian church, in the priestly garments and the religious rites, we recognize the stamp of exoteric heathenism. On no subject within the wide range of human knowledge has the world been more blinded or deceived with such persistent misrepresentation as on that of antiquity. Its hoary past and its religious faiths have been misrepresented and trampled under the feet of its successors. Its hierophants and prophets, mystei and epoptei, of the once sacred Adita of the temple shown as demoniacs and devil worshippers. donned in the despoiled garments of the victim, the Christian priest now anathematizes the latter with rites and ceremonies which he has learned from the theurgists themselves. The Mosaic Bible is used as a weapon against the people who furnished it. The heathen philosopher is cursed under the very roof which has witnessed his initiation. And the monkey of God, i.e., the devil of Tertullian, the originator and founder of magical theurgy, the science of illusions and lies, whose father and author is the demon, is exorcised with holy water by the hand which holds the identical lituus with which the ancient augur, after a solemn prayer, used to determine the regions of heaven and evoke, in the name of the highest, the minor god, now termed the devil, who unveiled to his eyes futurity and enabled him to prophesy. On the part of the Christians and the clergy, it is nothing but shameful ignorance, prejudice, and that contemptible pride so boldly denounced by one of their own reverend ministers, T. Gross, which rails against all investigation
as a useless or a criminal labor, when it must be feared that they will result in the overthrow of pre-established systems of faith.
On the part of the scholars, it is the same apprehension of the possible necessity of having to modify some of their erroneously established theories of science. Nothing but such pitiable prejudice, says Gross,
can have thus misrepresented the theology of heathenism and distorted, nay, caricatured its forms of religious worship. It is time that posterity should raise its voice in vindication of violated truth, and that the present age should learn a little of that common sense of which it boasts with as much self-complacency as if the prerogative of reason was the birthright only of modern times.
All this gives a sure clue to the real cause of the hatred felt by the early and medieval Christian toward his pagan brother and dangerous rival. We hate but what we fear. The Christian thaumaturgist, once having broken all association with the mysteries of the temples and with these schools so renowned for magic, described by St. Hilarion, could certainly expect but little to rival the pagan wonder-workers. No apostle, with the exception perhaps of healing by mesmeric power, has ever equalled Apollonius of Tyana. And the scandal created among the apostles by the miracle-doing Simon Magus is too notorious to be repeated here again. How is it, asks Justin Martyr in evident dismay,
how is it that the talismans of Apollonius the Talismata have power in certain members of creation? For they prevent, as we see, the fury of the waves, and the violence of the winds, and the attacks of wild beasts. And whilst our Lord's miracles are preserved by tradition alone, those of Apollonius are most numerous, and actually manifested in present facts, so as to lead astray all beholders.
This perplexed martyr solves the problem by attributing very correctly the efficacy and potency of the charms used by Apollonius to his profound knowledge of the sympathies and antipathies or repugnances of nature. Unable to deny the evident superiority of their enemies' powers, the fathers had recourse to the old but ever-successful method, that of slander. They honored the theurgists with the same insinuating calumny that had been resorted to by the Pharisees against Jesus. "Thou hast a demon," the elders of the Jewish synagogue had said to him. "Thou hast the devil," repeated the cunning fathers with equal truth, addressing the pagan thaumaturgist. And the widely bruited charge, erected later into an article of faith, won the day. But the modern heirs of these ecclesiastical falsifiers who charge magic, spiritualism, and even magnetism with being produced by a demon forget, or perhaps never read, the classics. None of our bigots has ever looked with more scorn on the abuses of magic than did the true initiate of old. No modern or even medieval law could be more severe than that of the Hierophant. True, he had more discrimination, charity, and justice than the Christian clergy. For while banishing the unconscious sorcerer, the person troubled with a demon, from within the sacred precincts of the Adita, the priests, instead of mercilessly burning him, took care of the unfortunate possessed one. Having hospitals expressly for that purpose in the neighborhood of temples, the ancient medium, if obsessed, was taken care of and restored to health. But with one who had, by conscious witchcraft, acquired powers dangerous to his fellow creatures, the priests of old were as severe as justice herself. Any person accidentally guilty of homicide or of any crime or convicted of witchcraft was excluded from the Eleusinian mysteries, and so were they from all others. This law, mentioned by all writers on the ancient initiation, speaks for itself. The claim of Augustine that all the explanations given by the Neoplatonists were invented by themselves is absurd. For nearly every ceremony in their true and successive order is given by Plato himself, in a more or less covered way. The mysteries are as old as the world, and one well versed in the esoteric mythologies of various nations can trace them back to the days of the ante-Vedic period in India. A condition of the strictest virtue and purity is required from the Vatu or candidate in India before he can become an initiate. Whether he aims to be a simple fakir, a purohita, public priest, or a sannyasi, a saint of the second degree of initiation, the most holy as the most revered of them all. After having conquered in the terrible trials preliminary to admittance to the inner temple in the subterranean crypts of his pagoda, the sannyasi passes the rest of his life in the temple, practicing the 84 rules and 10 virtues prescribed to the yogis.
No one who has not practiced, during his whole life, the 10 virtues which the divine Manu makes incumbent as a duty, can be initiated into the mysteries of the council.
Say the Hindu books of initiation. These virtues are
Resignation, the act of rendering good for evil; temperance, probity, purity, chastity, repression of the physical senses, the knowledge of the holy scriptures, that of the superior soul, spirit, worship of truth, abstinence from anger. These virtues must alone direct the life of a true yogi. No unworthy adept ought to defile the ranks of the holy initiates by his presence for 24 hours.
The adept becomes guilty after having once broken any one of these vows. Surely the exercise of such virtues is inconsistent with the idea one has of devil worship and lasciviousness of purpose. And now we will try to give a clear insight into one of the chief objects of this work. What we desire to prove is that underlying every ancient popular religion was the same ancient wisdom doctrine, one and identical, professed and practiced by the initiates of every country, who alone were aware of its existence and importance. To ascertain its origin and the precise age in which it was matured is now beyond human possibility. A single glance, however, is enough to assure one that it could not have attained the marvelous perfection in which we find it pictured to us in the relics of the various esoteric systems, except after a succession of ages. a philosophy so profound, a moral code so ennobling, and practical results so conclusive and so uniformly demonstrable is not the growth of a generation or even a single epoch. Fact must have been piled upon fact, deduction upon deduction. Science have begotten science, and myriads of the brightest human intellects have reflected upon the laws of nature before this ancient doctrine had taken concrete shape. The proofs of this identity of fundamental doctrine in the old religions are found in the prevalence of a system of initiation, in the secret sacerdotal castes who had the guardianship of mystical words of power and a public display of a phenomenal control over natural forces, indicating association with preter-human beings. Every approach to the mysteries of all these nations was guarded with the same jealous care, and in all, the penalty of death was inflicted upon initiates of any degree who divulged the secrets entrusted to them. We had seen that such was the case in the Eleusinian and Bacchic mysteries, among the Chaldean Magi and the Egyptian Hierophants, while with the Hindus, from whom they were all derived, the same rule has prevailed from time immemorial. We are left in no doubt upon this point. For the Agrushada Pariksha says explicitly,
Every initiate, to whatever degree he may belong, who reveals the great sacred formula, must be put to death.
Naturally enough, this same extreme penalty was prescribed in all the multifarious sects and brotherhoods which at different periods have sprung from the ancient stock. We find it with the early Essenes, Gnostics, theurgic Neoplatonists, and medieval philosophers. And in our day, even the Masons perpetuate the memory of the old obligations in the penalties of throat-cutting, dismemberment, and disemboweling with which the candidate is threatened. As the Masonic master's word is communicated only at low breath, so the self-same precaution is prescribed in the Chaldean Book of Numbers and the Jewish Merkaba. When initiated, the neophyte was led by an ancient to a secluded spot, and there the latter whispered in his ear the great secret. The Mason swears, under the most frightful penalties, that he will not communicate the secrets of any degree to a brother of an inferior degree. And the Agrushada Pariksha says,
Any initiate of the third degree who reveals before the prescribed time to the initiates of the second degree the superior truths must be put to death.
Again, the Masonic apprentice consents to have his tongue torn out by the roots if he divulge anything to a profane. And in the Hindu books of initiation, the same Agrushada Pariksha, we find that any initiate of the first degree, the lowest, who betrays the secrets of his initiation, to members of other castes, for whom the science should be a closed book, must have his tongue cut out and suffer other mutilations. As we proceed, we will point out the evidences of this identity, of vows, formulas, rites, and doctrines between the ancient faiths. We will also show that not only their memory is still preserved in India, but also that the secret association is still alive and as active as ever. That, after reading what we have to say, it may be inferred that the chief pontiff and hierophants, the Brahmatma, is still accessible to those who know, though perhaps recognized by another name, and that the ramifications of his influence extend throughout the world. But we will now return again to the early Christian period, as though he were not aware that there was any esoteric significance to the exoteric symbols, and that the mysteries themselves were composed of two parts, the lesser at Agre, and the higher ones at Eleusinia, Clemens Alexandrinus, with a rancorous bigotry that one might expect from a renegade Neoplatonist, but is astonished to find in this generally honest and learned father stigmatized the mysteries as indecent and diabolical. Whatever were the rites enacted among the neophytes before they passed to a higher form of instruction, however misunderstood were the trials of catharsis or purification, during which they were submitted to every kind of probation, and however much the immaterial or physical aspect might have led to calumny, it is but wicked prejudice which can compel a person to say that under this external meaning there was not a far deeper and spiritual significance. It is positively absurd to judge the ancients from our own standpoint of propriety and virtue. And most assuredly, it is not for the Church, which now stands accused by all the modern symbologists of having adopted precisely these same emblems in their coarsest aspect, and feels herself powerless to refute the accusations, to throw the stone at those who were her models. When men like Pythagoras, Plato, and Iamblichus, renowned for their severe morality, took part in the mysteries and spoke of them with veneration, it behooves our modern critics to judge them so rashly upon their merely external aspects. Iamblichus explains the worst, and his explanation for an unprejudiced mind ought to be perfectly plausible. Exhibitions of this kind, he says,
in the mysteries were designed to free us from licentious passions, by gratifying the sight and at the same time vanquishing all evil thought, through the awful sanctity with which these rites were accompanied.
The wisest and best men in the pagan world, adds Dr. Warburton,
are unanimous in this, that the mysteries were instituted pure and proposed the noblest ends by the worthiest means.
In these celebrated rites, although persons of both sexes and all classes were allowed to take a part, and a participation in them was even obligatory, very few indeed attained the higher and final initiation. The gradation of the mysteries is given us by Proclus in the 4th book of his Theology of Plato.
The perfective rite telete precedes in order the initiation, muesis, and the initiation epopteia, or the final apocalypse, revelation.
Theon of Smyrna in Mathematica also divides the mystic rites into 5 parts.
The first of which is the previous purification, for neither are the mysteries communicated to all who are willing to receive them. There are certain persons who are prevented by the voice of the crier, xerx, since it is necessary that such as are not expelled from the mysteries should first be refined by certain purifications which the reception of the sacred rites succeeds. The third part is denominated epopteia, or reception, and the fourth, which is the end and design of the revelation, is the binding of the head and fixing of the crowns, whether after this he, the initiated person, becomes an hierophant or sustains some other part of the sacerdotal office. But the fifth, which is produced from all these, is friendship and interior communion with God.
And this was the last and most awful of all the mysteries. There are writers who have often wondered at the meaning of this claim to a friendship and interior communion with God. Christian authors have denied the pretensions of the pagans to such communion, affirming that only Christian saints were and are capable of enjoying it. Materialistic skeptics have altogether scoffed at the idea of both. After long ages of religious materialism and spiritual stagnation, it has most certainly become difficult, if not altogether impossible, to substantiate the claims of either party. The old Greeks, who had once crowded around the Agora of Athens with its altar to the unknown god, are no more. And their descendants firmly believe that they have found the unknown in the Jewish Jehovah. The divine ecstasies of the early Christians have made room for visions of a more modern character, in perfect keeping with progress and civilization. The Son of Man, appearing to the rapt vision of the ancient Christian as coming from the seventh heaven, in a cloud of glory and surrounded with angels and winged seraphim, has made room for a more prosaic and at the same time more business-like Jesus. The latter is now shown as making morning calls upon Mary and Martha in Bethany, as seating himself on the ottoman with the younger sister, a lover of ethics, while Martha goes off to the kitchen to cook. Anon the heated fancy of a blasphemous Brooklyn preacher and harlequin, the Reverend Dr. Talmage, makes us see her rushing back.
With besweated brow, a pitcher in one hand and the tongs in the other, into the presence of Christ,
and blowing him up for not caring that her sister hath left her to serve alone. From the birth of the solemn and majestic conception of the unrevealed deity of the ancient adepts, to such caricatured descriptions of him who died on the cross for his philanthropic devotion to humanity, long centuries have intervened, and their heavy tread seems to have almost entirely obliterated all sense of a spiritual religion from the hearts of his professed followers. No wonder, then, that the sentence of Proclus is no longer understood by the Christians, and is rejected as a vagary by the materialists, who, in their negation, are less blasphemous and atheistical than many of the reverends and members of the churches. But, although the Greek epoptei are no more, we have now, in our own age, a people far more ancient than the oldest Hellenes, who practice the so-called preterhuman gifts to the same extent as did their ancestors far earlier than the days of Troy. It is to this people that we draw the attention of the psychologist and philosopher. One need not go very deep into the literature of the Orientalists to become convinced that in most cases they do not even suspect that in degree the arcane philosophy of India there are depths which they have not sounded, and cannot sound, for they pass on without perceiving them. There is a pervading tone of conscious superiority, a ring of contempt in the treatment of Hindu metaphysics, as though the European mind is alone, enlightened enough to polish the rough diamond of the old Sanskrit writers, and separate right from wrong for the benefit of their descendants. We see them disputing over the external forms of expression without a conception of the great vital truths these hide from the profane view. As a rule, the Brahmins, says Jacoliot,
rarely go beyond the class of grihesta, priests of the vulgar castes, and purahita, exorcisers, divines, prophets, and evocators of spirits. And yet we shall see, once that we have touched upon the question and study of manifestations and phenomena, that these initiates of the first degree, the lowest attribute to themselves, and in appearance possess faculties developed to a degree which has never been equaled in Europe. As to the initiates of the second, and especially of the third category, they pretend to be enabled to ignore time, space, and to command life and death.
Such initiates as these Monsieur Jacoliot did not meet, for as he says himself, they only appear on the most solemn occasions, and when the faith of the multitudes has to be strengthened by phenomena of a superior order.
They are never seen, either in the neighborhood of or even inside the temples, except at the grand quinquennial festival of the fire. On that occasion, they appear about the middle of the night, on a platform erected in the center of the sacred lake, like so many phantoms, and by their conjurations they illumine the space. A fiery column of light ascends from around them, rushing from earth to heaven. Unfamiliar sounds vibrate through the air, and 500,000 or 600,000 Hindus gathered from every part of India to contemplate these demigods throw themselves with their faces buried in the dust, invoking the souls of their ancestors.
Let any impartial person read the Spiritisme dans le monde, and he cannot believe that this implacable rationalist, as Jacolliot takes pride in terming himself, said one word more than is warranted by what he had seen. His statements support and are corroborated by those of other skeptics. As a rule, the missionaries, even after passing half a lifetime in the country of devil worship, as they call India, either disingenuously deny altogether what they cannot help knowing to be true, or ridiculously attribute phenomena to this power of the devil that outrival the miracles of the apostolic ages. And what do we see this French author, notwithstanding his incorrigible rationalism, forced to admit after having narrated the greatest wonders? Watch the fakirs as he would, he is compelled to bear the strongest testimony to their perfect honesty in the matter of their miraculous phenomena. Never, he says,
have we succeeded in detecting a single one in the act of deceit.
One fact should be noted by all who, without having been in India, still fancy they are clever enough to expose the fraud of pretended magicians. This skilled and cool observer, this redoubtable materialist after his long sojourn in India, affirms,
We unhesitatingly avow that we have not met, either in India or in Ceylon, a single European, even among the oldest residents, who has been able to indicate the means employed by these devotees for the production of these phenomena.
and how should they? Does not this zealous Orientalist confess to us that even he, who had every available means at hand to learn many of their rites and doctrines at first hand, failed in his attempts to make the Brahmins explain to him their secrets?
All that our most diligent inquiries of the Porohitas could elicit from them respecting the acts of their superiors, the invisible initiates of the temples, amounts to very little.
And again, speaking of one of the books, he confesses that while purporting to reveal all that is desirable to know, it
falls back into mysterious formulas in combinations of magical and occult letters, the secret of which it has been impossible for us to penetrate, etc.
The fakirs, although they can never reach beyond the first degree of initiation, are notwithstanding the only agents between the living world and the silent brothers, or those initiates who never cross the thresholds of their sacred dwellings. The Fukara yogis belong to the temples, and who knows but these Cenobites of the sanctuary have far more to do with the psychological phenomena which attend the fakirs, and have been so graphically described by Jacolliot than the Pitris themselves. Who can tell but that the fluidic spectre of the ancient Brahman seen by Jacolliot was the Sinleka, the spiritual double of one of these mysterious sannyasi? Although the story has been translated and commented upon by Professor Purty of Geneva, still we will venture to give it in Jacolliot's own words. Although the story has been translated and commented upon by Professor Purty of Geneva, still we will venture to give it in Jacoliot's own words.
A moment after the disappearance of the hands, the fakir, continuing his evocations, mantras, more earnestly than ever, a cloud like the first, but more opalescent and more opaque, began to hover near the small brazier, which, by request of the Hindu, I had constantly fed with live coals. Little by little it assumed a form entire human, and I distinguished the spectre, for I cannot call it otherwise, of an old Brahman sacrificator, kneeling near the little brazier. He bore on his forehead the signs sacred to Vishnu, and around his body the triple cord, sign of the initiates of the priestly caste. He joined his hands above his head as during the sacrifices, and his lips moved as if they were reciting prayers. At a given moment, he took a pinch of perfumed powder and threw it upon the coals. It must have been a strong compound, for a thick smoke arose on the instant and filled the two chambers. When it was dissipated, I perceived the spectre, which, 2 steps from me, was extending to me its fleshless hand. I took it in mine, making a salutation, and I was astonished to find it, although bony and hard, warm and living. "Art thou indeed," said I at this moment in a loud voice, "an ancient inhabitant of the earth?" I had not finished the question when the word yes appeared, and then disappeared in letters of fire on the breast of the old Brahmin, with an effect much like that which the word would produce if written in the dark with a stick of phosphorus. "Will you leave me nothing in token of your visit?" I continued. The spirit broke the triple cord composed of 3 strands of cotton which begirt his loins, gave it to me, and vanished at my feet. O Brahma, what is this mystery which takes place every night? When lying on the matting with eyes closed, the body is lost sight of, and the soul escapes to enter into conversation with the Pitris. Watch over it, O Brahma, when, forsaking the resting body, it goes away to hover over the waters, to wander in the immensity of heaven, and penetrate into the dark and mysterious nooks of the valleys and grand forests of the Himavat. Agrushada Parikshay.
The fakirs, when belonging to some particular temple, never act but under orders. Not one of them, unless he has reached a degree of extraordinary sanctity, is freed from the influence and guidance of his guru, his teacher, who first initiated and instructed him in the mysteries of the occult sciences. Like the subject of the European mesmerizer, the average fakir can never rid himself entirely of the psychological influence exercised on him by his guru. Having passed 2 or 3 hours in the silence and solitude of the inner temple in prayer and meditation, the fakir, when he emerges thence, is mesmerically strengthened and prepared. He produces wonders far more varied and powerful than before he entered. The master has laid his hands upon him, and the fakir feels strong. It may be shown, on the authority of many Brahmanical and Buddhist sacred books, that there has ever existed a great difference between adepts of the higher order and purely psychological subjects, like many of these fakirs who are mediums in a certain qualified sense. True, the fakir is ever talking of Pitris, and this is natural, for they are his protecting deities. But are the Pitris disembodied human beings of our race? This is the question, and we will discuss it in a moment. We say that the fakir may be regarded in a degree as a medium, for he is, what is not generally known, under the direct mesmeric influence of a living adept, his sannyasi or guru. When the latter dies, the power of the former, unless he has received the last transfer of spiritual forces, wanes and often even disappears. Why, if it were otherwise, should the fakirs have been excluded from the right of advancing to the second and third degree. The lives of many of them exemplify a degree of self-sacrifice and sanctity unknown and utterly incomprehensible to Europeans, who shudder at the bare thought of such self-inflicted tortures. But however shielded from control by vulgar and earthbound spirits, however wide the chasm between a debasing influence and their self-controlled souls, and however well protected by the seven-knotted magical bamboo rod which he receives from the guru, still the fakir lives in the outer world of sin and matter, and it is possible that his soul may be tainted, perchance, by the magnetic emanations from profane objects and persons, and thereby open an access to strange spirits and gods. To admit one so situated, one not under any and all circumstances sure of the mastery over himself, to a knowledge of the awful mysteries and priceless secrets of initiation, would be impracticable. It would not only imperil the security of that which must at all hazards be guarded from profanation, but it would be consenting to admit behind the veil a fellow being whose mediumistic irresponsibility might at any moment cause him to lose his life through an involuntary indiscretion. The same law which prevailed in the Eleusinian mysteries before our era holds good now in India. Not only must the adept have mastery over himself, but he must be able to control the inferior grades of spiritual beings, nature spirits, and earthbound souls. In short, the very ones by whom, if by any, the fakir is liable to be affected. For the objector to affirm that the Brahman adepts and the fakirs admit that of themselves they are powerless and can only act with the help of disembodied human spirits is to state that these Hindus are unacquainted with the laws of their sacred books and even the meaning of the word Pitris. The laws of Manu, the Atharva Veda, and other books prove what we now say. All that exists, says the Atharva Veda,
is in the power of the gods. The gods are under the power of magical conjurations. The magical conjurations are under the control of the Brahmans. Hence the gods are in the power of the Brahmans.
This is logical, albeit seemingly paradoxical, and it is the fact. And this fact will explain to those who have not hitherto had the clue, among whom Jacoliot must be numbered, as will appear on reading his works, why the fakir should be confined to the first or lowest degree of that course of initiation whose highest adepts or hierophants are the sannyasis or members of the ancient Supreme Council of 70. Moreover, in Book 1 of the Hindu Genesis or Book of Creation of Manu, the Pitris are called the lunar ancestors of the human race. They belong to a race of beings different from ourselves and cannot properly be called human spirits in the sense in which the spiritualists use this term. This is what is said of them.
Then they, the gods, created the Jakshas, the Rakshasas, the Pisatas, the Gandharvas and the Apsaras, and the Asuras, the Nagas, the Sarpas, and the Suparnas, and the Pitris, lunar ancestors of the human race. See Institutes of Manu, Book 1, Shloka 37, where the Pitris are termed progenitors of mankind.
The Pitris are a distinct race of spirits belonging to the mythological hierarchy, or rather to the Kabbalistical nomenclature, and must be included with the good genii, the demons of the Greeks, or the inferior gods of the invisible world. And when a fakir attributes his phenomena to the Pitris, he means only what the ancient philosophers and theurgists meant when they maintained that all the miracles were obtained through the intervention of the gods, or the good and bad demons, who control the powers of nature, the elementals, who are subordinate to the power of him who knows. A ghost or human phantom would be termed by a fakir palit or chutna as that of a female human spirit, Pichalpai, not Pitras. True, Pitara means, plural, fathers, ancestors, and Pitrii is a kinsman, but these words are used in quite a different sense from that of the Pitras invoked in the mantras. To maintain before a devout Brahman or a fakir that anyone can converse with the spirits of the dead would be to shock him with what would appear to him blasphemy. Does not the concluding verse of the Bhagavat state that this supreme felicity is alone reserved to the holy sannyasis, the gurus, and yogis?
Long before they finally rid themselves of their mortal envelopes, the souls who have practiced only good, such as those of the sannyasis and the vanaprasthas, acquire the faculty of conversing with the souls which preceded them to the Svarga.
In this case, the Pitris instead of genii are the spirits, or rather souls, of the departed ones. But they will freely communicate only with those whose atmosphere is as pure as their own, and to whose prayerful kalasa, invocation, they can respond without the risk of defiling their own celestial purity. When the soul of the invocator has reached the sayadyam, or perfect identity of essence with the universal soul, when matter is utterly conquered, then the adept can freely enter into daily and hourly communion with those who, though unburdened with their corporeal forms, are still themselves progressing through the endless series of transformations included in the gradual approach to the Paramatma, or the grand universal soul. Bearing in mind that the Christian fathers have always claimed for themselves and their saints the name of friends of God, and knowing that they borrowed this expression with many others from the technology of the pagan temples, it is but natural to expect them to show an evil temper whenever alluding to these rites. Ignorant, as a rule, and having had biographers as ignorant as themselves, we could not well expect them to find in the accounts of their beatific visions a descriptive beauty such as we find in the pagan classics. Whether the visions and objective phenomena claimed by both the fathers of the desert and the hierophants of the sanctuary are to be discredited or accepted as facts. The splendid imagery employed by Proclus and Apuleius in narrating the small portion of the final initiation that they dared reveal throws completely into the shade the plagiaristic tales of the Christian ascetics, faithful copies though they were intended to be. The story of the temptation of St. Anthony in the desert by the female demon is a parody upon the preliminary trials of the neophyte during the Mikra, or minor, mysteries of Agrai. Those rites, at the thought of which Clemens railed so bitterly, and which represented the bereaved Demeter in search of her child, and her good-natured hostess Baubo. Without entering again into a demonstration that in Christian and especially Irish Roman Catholic churches the same apparently indecent customs as the above prevailed until the end of the last century, we will recur to the untiring labours of that honest and brave defender of the ancient faith, Thomas Taylor, and his works. However much dogmatic Greek scholarship may have found to say against his mistranslations, his memory must be dear to every true Platonist who seeks rather to learn the inner thought of the great philosopher than enjoy the mere external mechanism of his writings. Better classical translators may have rendered us, in more correct phraseology, Plato's words, but Taylor shows us Plato's meaning, and this is more than can be said of Zeller, Jowett, and their predecessors. Yet, as writes Professor A. Wilder,
Taylor's works have met with favour at the hands of men capable of profound and recondite thinking. and it must be conceded that he was endowed with a superior qualification, that of an intuitive perception of the interior meaning of the subjects which he considered. Others may have known more Greek, but he knew more Plato.
Taylor devoted his whole useful life to the search after such old manuscripts as would enable him to have his own speculations concerning several obscure rites in the mysteries, corroborated by writers who had been initiated themselves. It is with full confidence in the assertions of various classical writers that we say that ridiculous, perhaps licentious in some cases, as may appear ancient worship to the modern critic, it ought not to have so appeared to the Christians. During the medieval ages, and even later, they accepted pretty nearly the same without understanding the secret import of its rites, and quite satisfied with the obscure and rather fantastic interpretations of their clergy, who accepted the exterior form and distorted the inner meaning. We are ready to concede, in full justice, that centuries have passed since the great majority of the Christian clergy, who are not allowed to pry into God's mysteries nor seek to explain that which the Church has once accepted and established, have had the remotest idea of their symbolism, whether in its exoteric or esoteric meaning. Not so with the head of the Church and its highest dignitaries. And if we fully agree with Inman that it is difficult to believe that the ecclesiastics who sanctioned the publication of such prints could have been as ignorant as modern ritualists, we are not at all prepared to believe with the same author
that the latter, if they knew the real meaning of the symbols commonly used by the Roman Church, would not have adopted them.
To eliminate what is plainly derived from the sex and nature worship of the ancient heathens would be equivalent to pulling down the whole Roman Catholic image worship, the Madonna element, and reforming the faith to Protestantism. The enforcement of the late dogma of the Immaculation was prompted by this very secret reason. The science of symbology was making too rapid progress. Blind faith in the Pope's infallibility and in the immaculate nature of the Virgin and of her ancestral female lineage, to a certain remove, could alone save the Church from the indiscreet revelations of science. It was a clever stroke of policy on the part of the vicegerent of God. What matters it if, by conferring upon her such an honour as Don Pascal de Francisis naively expresses it, he has made a goddess of the Virgin Mary, an Olympian deity, who, having been by her very nature placed in the impossibility of sinning, can claim no virtue, no personal merit for her purity, precisely for which, as we were taught to believe in our younger days, she was chosen among all other women. If His Holiness has deprived her of this, perhaps, on the other hand, he thinks that he has endowed her with at least one physical attribute not shared by the other virgin goddesses. But even this new dogma, which in company with the new claim to infallibility has quasi-revolutionized the Christian world, is not original with the Church of Rome. It is but a return to a hardly remembered heresy of the early Christian ages, that of the Collyridians, so called from their sacrificing cakes to the Virgin, whom they claimed to be virgin-born. The new sentence, "O Virgin Mary conceived without sin," is simply a tardy acceptance of that which was at first deemed a blasphemous heresy by the Orthodox Fathers. To think for one moment that any of the popes, cardinals, or other high dignitaries were not aware from the first to the last of the external meanings of their symbols is to do injustice to their great learning and their spirit of Machiavellism. It is to forget that the emissaries of Rome will never be stopped by any difficulty which can be skirted by the employment of Jesuitical artifice. The policy of complacent conformity was never carried to greater lengths than by the missionaries in Ceylon, who, according to the Abbé Dubois, certainly a learned and competent authority,
conducted the images of the Virgin and Saviour on triumphal cars, imitated from the orgies of Juggernaut, and introduced the dancers from the Brahminical rites into the ceremonial of the Church.
Let us at least thank these black-frocked politicians for their consistency in employing the car of Juggernaut, upon which the wicked heathen convey the lingam of Siva. To have used this car to carry in its turn the Romish representative of the female principle in nature is to show discrimination and a thorough knowledge of the oldest mythological conceptions. They have blended the two deities and thus represented in a Christian procession the heathen Brahma, or Nara, the father, Nari, the mother, and Viraji, the son. Says Manu,
The sovereign master who exists through himself divides his body into two halves, male and female, and from the union of these two principles is born Viraj, the son.
there was not a Christian father who could have been ignorant of these symbols in their physical meaning, for it is in this latter aspect that they were abandoned to the ignorant rabble. Moreover, they all had as good reasons to suspect the occult symbolism contained in these images. Although as none of them, Paul excepted perhaps, had been initiated, they could know nothing whatever about the nature of the final rites. Any person revealing these mysteries was put to death, regardless of sex, nationality, or creed. A Christian father would no more be proof against an accident than a pagan mister or the misties. If during the apparator or preliminary arcanes there were some practices which might have shocked the pudicity of a Christian convert, though we doubt the sincerity of such statements, their mystical symbolism was all sufficient to relieve the performance of any charge of licentiousness. Even the episode of the matron Baubo, whose rather eccentric method of consolation was immortalized in the Minor Mysteries, is explained by impartial mystagogues quite naturally. Ceres Demeter and her earthly wanderings in search of her daughter are the euhemerized descriptions of one of the most metaphysico-psychological subjects ever treated of by human mind. It is a mask for the transcendent narrative of the initiated seers, the celestial vision of the freed soul of the initiate of the last hour, describing the process by which the soul that has not yet been incarnated descends for the first time into matter.
Blessed is he who hath seen those common concerns of the underworld. He knows both the end of life and its divine origin from Jupiter.
Says Pindar. Taylor shows, on the authority of more than one initiate, that the
dramatic performances of the lesser mysteries were designed by their founders to signify occultly the condition of the unpurified soul invested with an earthly body and enveloped in a material and physical nature, that the soul, indeed, till purified by philosophy, suffers death through its union with the body.
The body is the sepulchre, the prison of the soul, and many Christian fathers held with Plato that the soul is punished through its union with the body. Such is the fundamental doctrine of the Buddhists, and of many Brahmanists too. When Plotinus remarks that,
when the soul has descended into generation from its half-divine condition, she partakes of evil, and is carried a great way into a state the opposite of her first purity and integrity, to be entirely merged in which is nothing more than to fall into dark mire.
He only repeats the teachings of Gautama Buddha. If we have to believe the ancient initiates at all, we must accept their interpretation of the symbols. And if, moreover, we find them perfectly coinciding with the teachings of the greatest philosophers, and that which we know symbolizes the same meaning in the modern mysteries in the East, we must believe them to be right. If Demeter was considered the intellectual soul, or rather the astral soul, half emanation from the spirit and half tainted with matter through a succession of spiritual evolutions, we may readily understand what is meant by the matron Baobo, the enchantress, who before she succeeds in reconciling the soul. Demeter, to its new position, finds herself obliged to assume the sexual forms of an infant. Baobo is matter, the physical body, and the intellectual, as yet pure astral soul can be ensnared into its new terrestrial prison, but by the display of innocent babyhood. Until then, doomed to her fate, Demeter, or Magna Mater, the soul, wonders and hesitates and suffers. But once having partaken of the magic potion prepared by Baobo, she forgets her sorrows. For a certain time she parts with that consciousness of higher intellect that she was possessed of before entering the body of a child. Thenceforth she must seek to rejoin it again. And when the age of reason arrives for the child, the struggle, forgotten for a few years of infancy, begins again. The astral soul is placed between matter, body, and the highest intellect, its immortal spirit or nous. Which of those two will conquer? The result of the battle of life lies between the triad. It is a question of a few years of physical enjoyment on earth, and if it has begotten abuse, of the dissolution of the earthly body being followed by death of the astral body, which thus is prevented from being united with the highest spirit of the triad, which alone confers on us individual immortality, or on the other hand, of becoming immortal Misty, initiated before death of the body into the divine truths of the afterlife. Demigods below and gods above. Such was the chief object of the mysteries represented as diabolical by theology and ridiculed by modern symbologists. To disbelieve that there exist in man certain arcane powers which, by psychological study, he can develop in himself to the highest degree, become an hierophant, and then impart to others under the same conditions of earthly discipline, is to cast an imputation of falsehood and lunacy upon a number of the best, purest, and most learned men of antiquity and of the Middle Ages. What the Hierophant was allowed to see at the last hour is hardly hinted at by them. And yet Pythagoras, Plato, Plotinus, Iamblichus, Proclus, and many others knew and affirmed their reality. Whether in the inner temple or through the study of theurgy carried on privately, or by the sole exertion of a whole life of spiritual labor, they all obtained the practical proof of such divine possibilities for man fighting his battle with life on earth to win a life in the eternity. What the last apoptia was is alluded to by Plato in Phaedrus.
Being initiated in those mysteries, which it is lawful to call the most blessed of all mysteries, we were freed from the molestations of evils which otherwise await us in a future period of time. Likewise, in consequence of this divine initiation, we became spectators of entire, simple, immovable, and blessed visions, resident in a pure light.
This sentence shows that they saw visions, gods, spirits. As Taylor correctly observes, from all such passages in the works of the initiates, it may be inferred
that the most sublime part of the epoptea consisted in beholding the gods themselves invested with a resplendent light.
or highest planetary spirits. The statement of Proclus upon this subject is unequivocal.
In all the initiations and mysteries, the gods exhibit many forms of themselves and appear in a variety of shapes, and sometimes, indeed, a formless light of themselves is held forth to the view. Sometimes this light is according to a human form, and sometimes it proceeds into a different shape. Whatever is on earth is the resemblance and shadow of something that is in the sphere, while that resplendent thing, the prototype of the soul spirit, remaineth in unchangeable condition. It is well also with its shadow. But when the resplendent one removeth far from its shadow, life removeth from the latter to a distance. And yet that very light is the shadow of something still more resplendent than itself.
Thus speaks Desatir, the Persian book of Shet, thereby showing its identity of esoteric doctrines with those of the Greek philosophers. The second statement of Plato confirms our belief that the mysteries of the ancients were identical with the initiations, as practiced now among the Buddhists and the Hindu adepts. The highest visions, the most truthful, are produced not through natural ecstatics or mediums, as it is sometimes erroneously asserted, but through a regular discipline of gradual initiations and development of psychical powers. The Mystae were brought into close union with those whom Proclus calls mystical natures, resplendent gods, because, as Plato says,
We were ourselves pure and immaculate, being liberated from this surrounding vestment, which we denominate body, and to which we are now bound like an oyster to its shell.
So the doctrine of planetary and terrestrial Pitris was revealed entirely in ancient India, as well as now, only at the last moment of initiation, and to the adepts of superior degrees. Many are the fakirs who, though pure and honest and self-devoted, have yet never seen the astral form of a purely human Pitar, an ancestor or father, otherwise than at the solemn moment of their first and last initiation. It is in the presence of his instructor, the Guru, and just before the Vatu Fakir is dispatched into the world of the living with his 7-knotted bamboo wand for all protection, that he is suddenly placed face to face with the unknown presence. He sees it and falls prostrate at the feet of the evanescent form, but is not entrusted with the great secret of its evocation, for it is the supreme mystery of the holy syllable. The Om contains the evocation of the Vedic triad, the Trimurti Brahma, Vishnu, Siva, say the Orientalists. It contains the evocation of something more real and objective than this triune abstraction, we say respectfully contradicting the eminent scientists. It is the trinity of man himself, on his way to become immortal through the solemn union of his inner triune self, the exterior gross body, the husk not even being taken in consideration in this human trinity. It is when this trinity, in anticipation of the final triumphant reunion beyond the gates of corporeal death, became for a few seconds a unity, that the candidate is allowed at the moment of the initiation to behold his future self. Thus we read in the Persian Desatir of the resplendent one, in the Greek philosopher initiates of the Ogoides, the self-shining blessed vision resident in the pure light, in Porphyry, that Plotinus was united to his God 6 times during his lifetime, and so on.
In ancient India, the mystery of the triad, known but to the initiates, could not, under the penalty of death, be revealed to the vulgar,
says Vrihaspati. Neither could it in the ancient Grecian and Samothracian mysteries, nor can it be now. It is in the hands of the adept facts, and must remain a mystery to the world so long as the materialistic savant regards it as an undemonstrated fallacy, an insane hallucination, and the dogmatic theologian a snare of the evil one. Subjective communication with the human, God-like spirits of those who have preceded us to the silent land of bliss is in India divided into 3 categories. Under the spiritual training of a guru or sannyasi, the vatu, disciple or neophyte, begins to feel them. Were he not under the immediate guidance of an adept, he would be controlled by the invisibles and utterly at their mercy. For among these subjective influences he is unable to discern the good from the bad. Happy the sensitive who is sure of the purity of his spiritual atmosphere. To this subjective consciousness, which is the first degree, is, after a time, added that of clairaudience. This is the second degree or stage of development. The sensitive, when not naturally made so by psychological training, now audibly hears, but is still unable to discern and is incapable of verifying his impressions, and one who is unprotected, the tricky powers of the air, but too often delude with semblances of voices and speech. But the guru's influence is there. It is the most powerful shield against the intrusion of the hutna into the atmosphere of the vatu, consecrated to the pure human and celestial pitris. The third degree is that when the fakir or any other candidate both feels, hears, and sees, and when he can at will produce the reflections of the pitris on the mirror of astral light. All depends upon his psychological and mesmeric powers, which are always proportionate to the intensity of his will. But the fakir will never control the akasa, the spiritual life principle, the omnipotent agent of every phenomenon, in the same degree as an adept of the third and highest initiation. And the phenomena produced by the will of the latter do not generally run the marketplaces for the satisfaction of open-mouthed investigators. The unity of God, the immortality of the Spirit, belief in salvation only through our works, merit and demerit. Such are the principal articles of faith of the wisdom religion, and the groundwork of Vedaism, Buddhism, Parsism, and such, we find to have been even that of the ancient Osirism, when we, after abandoning the popular sun god to the materialism of the rabble, confine our attention to the books of Hermes, the thrice great.
The thought concealed as yet the world in silence and darkness. Then the Lord, who exists through himself, and who is not to be divulged to the external senses of man, dissipated darkness, and manifested the perceptible world.
He that can be perceived only by the spirit, that escapes the organs of sense, who is without visible parts, eternal, the soul of all beings, that none can comprehend, displayed his own splendor. Manu, Book 1, Shlokas 6-7.
Such is the ideal of the Supreme in the mind of every Hindu philosopher.
Of all the duties, the principal one is to acquire the knowledge of the Supreme Soul, the Spirit. It is the first of all sciences, for it alone confers on man immortality. Manu, Book 12, Shloka 85.
And our scientists talk of the nirvana of Buddha and the moksha of Brahma as of a complete annihilation. It is thus that the following verse is interpreted by some materialists.
The man who recognizes the Supreme Soul in his own soul, as well as in that of all creatures, and who is equally just to all, whether man or animals, obtains the happiest of all fates, that to be finally absorbed in the bosom of Brahma. Manu, Book 12, Shloka 125.
The doctrine of the moksha and the nirvana, as understood by the school of Max Muller, can never bear confronting with numerous texts that can be found, if required, as a final refutation. There are sculptures in many pagodas which contradict point-blank the imputation. Ask a Brahmin to explain moksha, address yourself to an educated Buddhist, and pray him to define for you the meaning of nirvana. Both will answer you that in every one of these religions, nirvana represents the dogma of the spirit's immortality. That, to reach the nirvana, means absorption into the great universal soul, the latter representing a state, not an individual being or an anthropomorphic god, as some understand the great existence. That a spirit reaching such a state becomes a part of the integral whole, but never loses its individuality for all that. Henceforth, the spirit lives spiritually, without any fear of further modifications of form, for a form pertains to matter, and the state of nirvana implies a complete purification, or a final riddance from even the most sublimated particle of matter. This word, absorbed, when it is proved that the Hindus and Buddhists believe in the immortality of the spirit, must necessarily mean intimate union, not annihilation. Let Christians call them idolaters, if they still dare do so in the face of science and the latest translations of the sacred Sanskrit books. They have no right to present the speculative philosophy of ancient sages as an inconsistency, and the philosophers themselves as illogical fools. With far better reason, we can accuse the ancient Jews of utter nihilism. There is not a word contained in the books of Moses, or the prophets either, which taken literally implies the spirit's immortality. Yet every devout Jew hopes as well to be gathered into the bosom of Abram. The Hierophants and some Brahmins are accused of having administered to their epoptai strong drinks or anesthetics to produce visions, which shall be taken by the latter as realities. They did and do use sacred beverages which, like the soma drink, possess the faculty of freeing the astral form from the bonds of matter. But in those visions there is as little to be attributed to hallucination as in the glimpses which the scientist, by the help of his optical instrument, gets into the microscopic world. A man cannot perceive, touch, and converse with pure spirit through any of his bodily senses. Only spirit alone can talk to and see spirit, and even our astral soul, the doppelganger, is too gross, too much tainted, yet with earthly matter to trust entirely to its perceptions and insinuations. How dangerous may often become untrained mediumship, and how thoroughly it was understood and provided against by the ancient sages, is perfectly exemplified in the case of Socrates. The old Grecian philosopher was a medium, hence he had never been initiated into the mysteries, for such was the rigorous law. But he had his familiar spirit, as they call it, his daemonion, and this invisible counsellor became the cause of his death. It is generally believed that if he was not initiated into the mysteries, it was because he himself neglected to become so. But the secret records teach us that it was because he could not be admitted to participate in the sacred rites, and precisely, as we state, on account of his mediumship. There was a law against the admission not only of such as were convicted of deliberate witchcraft, but even of those who were known to have a familiar spirit. The law was just and logical, because a genuine medium is more or less irresponsible, and the eccentricities of Socrates are thus accounted for in some degree. A medium must be passive, and if a firm believer in his spirit guide, he will allow himself to be ruled by the latter, not by the rules of the sanctuary. A medium of olden times, like the modern medium, was subject to be entranced at the will and pleasure of the power which controlled him. Therefore, he could not well have been entrusted with the awful secrets of the final initiation, never to be revealed under the penalty of death. The old sage, in unguarded moments of spiritual inspiration, revealed that which he had never learned and was therefore put to death as an atheist. How then, with such an instance as that of Socrates in relation to the visions and spiritual wonders at the apoptai of the inner temple, can anyone assert that these seers, theurgists, and thaumaturgists were all spirit mediums? Neither Pythagoras, Plato, nor any of the later, more important Neoplatonists, neither Iamblichus, Longinus, Proclus, nor Apollonius of Tyana were ever mediums, for in such case they would not have been admitted to the mysteries at all, as Taylor proves.
This assertion of divine visions in the mysteries is clearly confirmed by Plotinus, and in short, that magical evocation formed a part of the sacerdotal office in them, and that this was universally believed by all antiquity, long before the era of the later Platonists.
Shows that apart from natural mediumship, there has existed from the beginning of time a mysterious science, discussed by many, but known only to a few. The use of it is a longing toward our only true and real home, the afterlife, and a desire to cling more closely to our parent spirit. Abuse of it is sorcery, witchcraft, black magic. Between the two is placed natural mediumship, a soul clothed with imperfect matter, a ready agent for either the one or the other, and utterly dependent on its surroundings of life, constitutional heredity, physical as well as mental, and on the nature of the spirits it attracts around itself. A blessing or a curse, as fate will have it, unless the medium is purified of earthly dross. The reason why in every age so little has been generally known of the mysteries of initiation is twofold. The first has already been explained by more than one author, and lies in the terrible penalty following the least indiscretion. The second is the superhuman difficulties and even dangers which the daring candidate of old had to encounter, and either conquer or die in the attempt, when, what is still worse, he did not lose his reason. There was no real danger to him whose mind had become thoroughly spiritualized and so prepared for every terrific sight. He who fully recognized the power of his immortal spirit and never doubted for one moment its omnipotent protection had naught to fear. But woe to the candidate in whom the slightest physical fear, sickly child of matter, made him lose sight and faith in his own invulnerability. He who was not wholly confident of his moral fitness to accept the burden of these tremendous secrets was doomed. The Talmud gives the story of the 4 Tanaim, who are made, in allegorical terms, to enter into the garden of delights, i.e., to be initiated into the occult and final science.
According to the teaching of our holy masters, the names of the 4 who entered the garden of delight are Ben Asai, Ben Zoma, Asher, and Rabbi Akiba. Ben Asai looked and lost his sight. Ben Zoma looked and lost his reason. Asher made depredations in the plantation, mixed up the whole, and failed. But Akiba, who had entered in peace, came out of it in peace. For the saint, whose name be blessed, had said, "This old man is worthy of serving us with glory."
The learned commentators of the Talmud, the rabbis of the synagogue, explain that the Garden of Delight in which those four personages are made to enter, is but that mysterious science, the most terrible of sciences for weak intellects, which it leads directly to insanity.
Says A. Frank in his Kabbalah. It is not the pure at heart, and he who studies but with a view to perfecting himself and so more easily acquiring the promised immortality, who need have any fear, but rather he who makes of the science of sciences a sinful pretext for worldly motives, who should tremble. The latter will never withstand the Kabbalistic evocations of the supreme initiation. The licentious performances of the 1001 early Christian sects may be criticized by partial commentators as well as the ancient Eleusinian and other rites. But why should they incur the blame of the theologians, the Christians, when their own mysteries of the divine incarnation with Joseph, Mary, and the angel, in a sacred trilogue, used to be enacted in more than one country, and were famous at one time in Spain and southern France? Later, they fell like many other once secret rites into the hands of the populace. It is but a few years since, during every Christmas week, Punch and Judy boxes containing the above-named personages, an additional display of the infant Jesus in his manger, were carried about the country in Poland and southern Russia. They were called kaliadovki, a word the correct etymology of which we are unable to give unless it is from the verb kaliadovat, a word that we as willingly abandon to learned philologists. We have seen this show in our days of childhood. We remember the three king magi represented by three dolls in powdered wigs and coloured tights, and it is from recollecting the simple, profound veneration depicted on the faces of the pious audience that we can the more readily appreciate the honest and just remark by the editor in the introduction to the Eleusinian Mysteries, who says,
"It is ignorance which leads to profanation. Men ridicule what they do not properly understand. The undercurrent of this world is set toward one goal, and inside of human credulity, call it human weakness if you please, is a power almost infinite, a holy faith capable of apprehending the supremest truths of all existence."
If that abstract sentiment called Christian charity prevailed in the Church, we would be well content to leave all this unsaid. We have no quarrel with Christians whose faith is sincere and whose practice coincides with their profession. But with an arrogant, dogmatic, and dishonest clergy, we have nothing to do except to see the ancient philosophy, antagonized by modern theology and its puny offspring, spiritualism, defended and righted so far as we are able, so that its grandeur and sufficiency may be thoroughly displayed. It is not alone for the esoteric philosophy that we fight, nor for any modern system of moral philosophy, but for the inalienable right of private judgment, and especially for the ennobling idea of a future life of activity and accountability. We eagerly applaud such commentators as Godfrey Higgins, Inman, Payne Knight, King, Dunlap, and Dr. Newton, however much they disagree with our own mystical views, for their diligence is constantly being rewarded by fresh discoveries of the pagan paternity of Christian symbols. But otherwise, all these learned works are useless. Their researches only cover half the ground. Lacking the true key of interpretation, they see the symbols only in a physical aspect. They have no password to cause the gates of mystery to swing open, and ancient spiritual philosophy is to them a closed book. Diametrically opposed though they be to the clergy, in their ideas respecting it, in the way of interpretation, they do little more than their opponents for a questioning public. Their labours tend to strengthen materialism as those of the clergy, especially the Romish clergy, do to cultivate belief in diabolism. If the study of Hermetic philosophy held out no other hope of reward, it would be more than enough to know that by it we may learn with what perfection of justice the world is governed. A sermon upon this text is preached by every page of history. Among all, there is not one that conveys a deeper moral than the case of the Roman Church. The divine law of compensation was never more strikingly exemplified than in the fact that by her own act she has deprived herself of the only possible key to her own religious mysteries. The assumption of Godfrey Higgins that there are two doctrines maintained in the Roman Church, one for the masses and the other, the esoteric, for the perfect, or the initiates, as in the ancient mysteries, appears to us unwarranted and rather fantastic. They have lost the key, we repeat. Otherwise no terrestrial power could have prostrated her. And except a superficial knowledge of the means of producing miracles, her clergy can in no way be compared in their wisdom with the hierophants of old. In burning the works of the theurgists, in prescribing those who affect their study, in affixing the stigma of demonolatry to magic in general, Rome has left her exoteric worship and Bible to be helplessly riddled by every free thinker, her sexual emblems to be identified with coarseness, and her priests to unwittingly turn magicians and even sorcerers in their exorcisms, which are but necromantic evocations. Thus retribution, by the exquisite adjustment of divine law, is made to overtake this scheme of cruelty, injustice, and bigotry through her own suicidal acts. True philosophy and divine truth are convertible terms. A religion which dreads the light cannot be a religion based on either truth or philosophy. Hence, it must be false. The ancient mysteries were mysteries to the profane only, whom the hierophant never sought nor would accept as proselytes. To the initiates, the mysteries became explained as soon as the final veil was withdrawn. No mind like that of Pythagoras or Plato would have contented itself with an unfathomable and incomprehensible mystery like that of the Christian dogma. There can be but one truth, for two small truths on the same subject can but constitute one great error. Among thousands of exoteric or popular conflicting religions which have been propagated since the days when the first men were enabled to interchange their ideas, not a nation, not a people, nor the most abject tribe, but after their own fashion has believed in an unseen God, the first cause of unerring and immutable laws, and in the immortality of our spirit. No creed, no false philosophy, no religious exaggerations could ever destroy that feeling. It must, therefore, be based upon an absolute truth. On the other hand, every one of the numberless religions and religious sects views the deity after its own fashion, and fathering on the unknown its own speculations, it enforces these purely human outgrowths of overheated imagination on the ignorant masses, and calls them revelation. As the dogmas of every religion and sect often differ radically, they cannot be true. And if untrue, what are they? The greatest curse to a nation, remarks Dr. Inman,
is not a bad religion, but a form of faith which prevents manly inquiry. I know of no nation of old that was priest-ridden which did not fall under the swords of those who did not care for hierarchs. The greatest danger is to be feared from those ecclesiastics who wink at vice and encourage it as a means whereby they can gain power over their votaries. So long as every man does to other men as he would that they should do to him, and allows no one to interfere between him and his Maker, all will go well with the world.